Hello, myth lover. I'm Maria. Welcome to the Women and Mythology Podcast.
Shaping behavior even if we don't name it. When we know what we're demonizing and what we're idolizing, it's a bit like we get to really get a sense of who a person is. Even just at a dinner party, if we ask them, what do they hope for? And what are they afraid of? So even in just that, we get a sense of a person's worldview. And with what we're demonizing, is it either because we are that and it's part of our shadow? And what we're putting a halo on, is it actually aspirational, or is it actually a truth or a light that we want to bring into ourselves?
Mythmaker Podcast Network.
Hello, myth lover. Welcome back. For the first episode of the year of 2026, we turn our attention to the archetypal currents shaping our lives. Those invisible forces that organize our lives, our longings, and our collective unrest. It took me a little while to return to the podcast after the holiday break, partly because I'm learning to be more loyal to my cycles of rest, but also because I knew I wanted to begin this year in a very specific way, in conversation with Kristina Dryza. And even though we're both here in Australia, it took some time for our schedules to align and we could sit together and have this conversation. But here we are, and I couldn't be more excited. In this episode, we explore what it means to read the world symbolically, to sense beneath events, and to meet this moment not with performance or certainty, but with mythic discernment. Kristina Dryza is a futurist turned archetypal consultant, author, and TEDx speaker, whose work helps people perceive the unseen forces shaping their lives. Through myths and archetypes, her work reveals the deeper patterns beneath behavior, relationship, creativity, and societal change, offering what many of us have lost, an inner map. In our conversation, we spoke about archetypes as living forces rather than ideas, what we idolize and what we demonize as clues to the collective psyche, why 2026 marks a year of reckoning, the collapse of performative power and the call to inner authority, the absence of initiation and its psychological cost, Hestia as the still center and hearth we are being asked to return to, the underworld not as punishment but as initiation, and the myths that can guide us through this threshold. This is a grounded, spacious, and deeply human conversation, an invitation to listen beneath the noise, face what we might rather avoid, and sense what this moment is asking of us. Let's dive in. Hi, Kristina. Welcome. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you for the invitation. I'm so excited to be here.
Let's dive right in.
Okay.
You describe archetypes as universal patterns, instinct, survival, fate, soul. When you look at the world, what helps you sense the archetypal layer beneath events?
Yeah. Maybe if I can just take it a step back, because I don't know where the audience might be on the level of comprehension with archetypes. But because people might go, Arca what? But some might be, girlfriend, I'm university level. But it's really that archetypes are just patterns. They're patterns of experience, they're patterns of behavior, but they're often invisible. But what I find is that psychology will often look at content, but the archetypal seeing looks more at structure. In a way, archetypes aren't ideas we think about. They're actually forces that we're living inside. And what I do with my work in a way is bring visibility to these patterns, because they can be either negatively or constructively influencing you, or if we want to look at light and shadow in different languaging, it could be the grace and the challenge of a pattern. But yeah, I just feel the more awareness you have of patterns in yourself and in society, you engage them, you can consciously engage them in a completely different manner and have a new system of mapping. But if you're saying, how do I personally sense it? I think sometimes there's instinct, but that I feel is more reactive. Then there's intuition, there's the felt sense. It's just being aware of how the air is changing. But if I look at it more specifically in society, what am I observing? I'm observing what's being idolized versus what's being demonized, what's being rushed versus what's being avoided. Like, where language is collapsing into polarity, where have we lost nuance, or where have rituals disappeared or become hollow. So just some of those kind of issues.
I feel actually very attracted to this idea of what's being demonized and what's being idolized. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, sure. Because what we're actually looking for is, in a sense, a trend or something like that is often very fast, or at surface level, it's reactive, it's loud, it's short-lived, it's very attention-based out there. But if we look at what's happening with archetypal, it is actually not just slower and more deeper, but it's moving through the trend. So it's shaping behavior even if we don't name it. So when we know what we're demonizing and what we're idolizing, it's a bit like we get to really get a sense of who a person is, even just at a dinner party. If we ask them, what do they hope for? And what are they afraid of? So even in just that, we get a sense of a person's worldview. And with what we're demonizing, is it either because we are that and it's part of our shadow? And what we're putting a halo on, is it actually aspirational, or is it actually a truth or a light that we want to bring into ourselves?
That's very interesting. And actually, as a self-reflection prompt, can bring a lot forward as well. For you, what are the differences between a trend and an archetypal shift?
As I said earlier, so often trends are fabricated. They can be supported by big money. It might look like it's all around us, but actually it's an empty, hollow bubble. But to me, an archetypal shift versus, say, what a trend is in society, for me, I know it's an archetypal shift when it's actually reorganizing identity. Or even let's look at our own personal lives. It's very different when we start to embody it. It's more a tectonic shift. So we might say that there is a trend for recycling, but it's very different when we feel and know Gaia as a living being. There might be a trend for green juices, but it's also very different when we're in touch with the power of Chiron and the wounded healer. So I would say for me, an archetypal shift is more that metanoia, that term of that complete change of heart. It involves the volitional realm. There's a total embodiment. And I would say that trends, in a way, look, they can point us in the direction of what people are doing. But archetypes are, in a way, they're telling us why people cannot stop doing what they're doing.
Thank you for sharing that. That's very illuminating. And considering why people are doing what they're doing, what if 2026 had a title, like a chapter heading in the collective story, what would it be?
First, I hesitate to say, it might be a little bit early to know because we haven't had that through in our new year yet. Hasn't been Aries yet, the beginning of a cycle. And also we're working in a way with an artificial calendar in a way as well. So they're almost dates rather than truth in a more evolutionary kind of sense. But what I would say is you can already get a sense that this year is a year of reckoning. If I want to put it in a more extreme case, I could even say it might be evolve or die. But I think that we can even just in the first month of this year recognize that performative identity has stopped working. Spiritual bypassing collapses us. Our power must be embodied, not just declared. So there's a few things already that I think are leading us to be able to kind of say, while the previous years, obviously with the pandemic, where we might have said, oh, we're in the thick of it, of the underworld, or in the liminal. No, I actually think almost in a sense, it's willful obstruction if we now do not live to the level of truth that we've been exposed to. So most of us have all read the same books in some sense. Many of us have read The Hero with 1,000 Faces or The Power of Now. It's not a matter now of having read these books, but what is the level, the degree, and the truth that I embody what I have read or the teachings I've been exposed to. And I think that's where the reckoning comes from, where the disconnect between what we know and how we live, when it becomes too great, we will see a mass psychosis.
And considering this collective psyche, what do you feel are the archetypes that are mostly activated in people now?
One we could say is the sovereign, but I look, we can see it in language, like in the sense of you go queen and all the rest of that. But so often I think that when it gets activated in that sense, it's really not the queen, it's actually the shadow bully. But I think if we look at deeper, it's much more about we want that inner authority, the capacity to say, I rule myself. I also feel Demeter is very present in regards to collective grief, lost children, rest, environmental protection. We might even say the magical child is alive and well with a lot of the Delulu thinking that is out there. The perpetual maiden is another one where there's this linked also with the damsel in distress, almost like this endless becoming without any ever without ever actually arriving. So that perpetual maiden, I think, is another that's very active at the moment. But if I look at the sovereign, I think part of it is linked with this idea of what's dying, which is this heroic hustle, this performative strength and a burnout culture. So wanting then in response to that to be able to have agency over one's own life. And linked with that also too is the false father, hollow authority and institutions that don't really have a moral backbone, let alone a moral center. But I think bubbling away again, like underneath, if we look at all of these things, there's like unprocessed grief. We have so much rage that does it without a language, without structure, without the ability to, in a narrative form, express. If I start on the rage, I can even feel it myself, the depths of that. And I think in a way, longing for structure as well, but when we look for it, where sometimes it's being mislabeled as going backwards. And so I think another archetype that can be linked with this also is the initiate, where so many people at the moment are between identities. They are no longer who they were, but they have not yet reached the shore. I'm not really a fan of that best self, worst self kind of language. And as Carolyn Mace, who I studied archetypes with, she said, most of us can't even pull off our worst self, let alone our best selves. But I do think there's that aspect of the initiate where it's not about asking if we're ready, it's asking if we're willing. And what I feel in culture, because we do not have collective initiation and it's disappeared, pathology has in a way taken its place.
A lot of the archetypes that you mentioned, I feel the sovereign is a very empowering one. And it's one that brings agency to us. But some of the others you mentioned are actually very shadow-related archetypes. Are there archetypes that we can come into relationship with to help us during this time?
I think one of the best ones is Hestia. She's so invisible. She gave up her place in the pantheon. That's like how much we don't know about her. And I think she really is, she's the still center around which all center and which around, in a way, all movement actually occurs. And what I find so interesting about her is she doesn't actually go on quest, but what she does is she makes return possible. And that is what we're seeking, is that return. And she governs presence. She governs containment and continuity. And I think most importantly, she is not always asking us to expand. She's asking us to stay.
I love Hestia, and I love that you brought her. So for those who are not familiar, would you like to add a few words and introduce? Because as you said, Demeter is a very famous archetype. And if you're interested in myth, you probably heard of her already. But Hestia, not necessarily. Can you share a few more words on Hestia?
I would say she is very linked to the idea of the hearth, that inner fire. And I think, look, if we look at that, even just the way our houses are structured at the moment, the Wi-Fi is the center of the home, while previously it was like the hearth. I also think she is very much linked with the archetype of the circle. No one is above anyone in a circle. And that's why it's so powerful when we actually do sit in circle. But I also think what she actually brings is beyond what I would say, because obviously in the Greek myths, Xenia, the hospitality is one of its most important and key important tenet values. But I feel that actually what Hestia does is she turns also the gaze on in ourselves to be able to say, how do I welcome those exiled parts of myself back to myself? Not just as an external, in a way, representative of external hospitality, of always the light, the hearth, the warmth, the home, but more actually internal, as in what is that still center that, as I said, those exiled lost parts or a frightened aspect of us can always return to in safety and love and care.
She is an archetype to nourish, to come into relationship with, to learn from. What would you say is the counter side of Hestia, the shadow side of Hestia?
I would say it could be things like unprocessed grief. Again, that rage without language, those kind of aspects are still there. But I think part of it also is, I think it was Pablo Picasso that had this quote, which is females can either be a goddess or a doormat. And I think sometimes in the shadow, we might see more the doormat version of her than the goddess version of her.
Let's talk a little bit about how you work with archetypes. And I wonder, when did you begin to trust archetypes as a form of cultural literacy? Almost like another organ of perception, another way of seeing the...
Look, I think it's something that's a matter of continual evolution. I think it's something that all of us, that it really is an unfolding. But I would say it's now for myself, why and how do I trust that archetypal realm? I really do trust the right hemisphere of my brain. And for those of people that are interested, Ian McGilchrist has wonderful work about the right brain, which is much more related to poetic or pictorial perceiving, the power of imagination, spatial awareness. And by trusting, in a way, the right brain, I came to find that solutions that come outside of the closed cycle of logic usually have the most enduring kind of benefits. And again, I feel that if you want to say my love language is like symbols and myths and emotion rather than logic or technology or rationality. So that symbolic realm was, for some people, the symbolic realm can become almost their default realm, maybe through the study of astrology or something like that, or having to have learned lots of different languages, things. But for me, it was almost just this sense of an invisible world. But the invisible world to me, ever since a child, has been very real.
I'm there with you. I also feel this way, that I am moved and experience the world through this symbolic language. So, yeah. Which is probably what draws us to myth, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And now looking at 2025, but then also considering that we are starting the year of 2026, which archetype do you feel is like in costume at the moment, appearing at something else, and therefore harder for people to recognize? And I'm wondering if you can really point us to something that we are not seeing. Because I feel in the past years, perhaps the healer archetype was something that came up and we had to work with that and see that it's not necessarily a healer. It's a healer in disguise or in their shadow form. What would be the archetype of the moment now that needs to be seen?
I think on that, like, you hit the nail on the head perfectly. It was like the wounded healer that was masquerading as the integrated healer. And almost what we set up was the only way that you could enter the realm of healing was through your wound. And so, as again, Carolyn Mace would call it, woundology. And that became the language we all became fluent in. And so I think actually we will be seeing more of the integrated healer, less of the wounded one. But if we look at, say, today, I would say it would be the tech bros that are being positioned as our saviors. Because, yes, they may be offering technology as a solution, but they are offering it with absolutely no transformation of the psyche involved, which can only lead to disaster.
Thank you for saying that, Kristina. Honestly, I know you mentioned to me you didn't want to comment on politics, but how can we be active in the world and not comment on politics?
I'm super active.
I feel it's tricky. It's tricky for me too. But I would like to say that I agree with you when it comes to the tech bros, when it comes to technology as savior. And even 10 years ago, I was studying a lot of ecology, and technology was always appearing as the solution for climate change, as the solution for environmental issues, when actually we know that it's much deeper. We know that we need a shift within humanity. We need a shift in our relationship, not just physical relationship with the natural world, but a spiritual shift as well towards the natural world for things to happen. So if you'd like to elaborate a little bit more on technology as this shadowed archetype.
I'm more than action, I should say. But to get into that bit about the tech bros, what I would say, even it links into, people say, how did you get into all of this kind of stuff? And I was always fascinated by fate and destiny and free will and predetermination and what we actually have control over or kind of choice. And what I find is that it's not an either or proposition, whether it's fate or destiny. And by fate, I'm using the language of fate being the cards that you're dealt in life, and destiny, how you play the hand. That so often what we're trying to do is we're trying to have control and agency over the parts that we don't. And if anyone out there is like me, you have had accidents, you have had betrayals, you have had things that were written in the stars that one way or another, in whatever form, they were going to reach you. And there were some things that actually occurred that we ourselves actually had agency over, and we had our hands on the wheel and we lifted them off. And the one thing that I think that I can say with certain that we have all collectively pretended that we have no agency of, and it was in the realm of the gods, is the environment. And that is one place where I've gone, oh, yeah, I'm trying to control whether a person likes me or this or that, or put my finger on all these kind of pies. But the one thing that I do have the power to control over, this self-agency, is in regards to the environment. And we've dropped the ball on that. And I think part of that then actually leads into more people believing that the solution will come from something outside of us. So whether that is actually technology, a divine source, or something like that. But it actually leaves us in a real dangerous place of passivity and victimization. And I do actually feel that, again, if we keep positioning these technology and these particular tech bros as having a kind of like some genius savant that we sell or gene that we don't have, then almost in a sense, we forget almost why we are here as a human being on the earth in this point of time. And that is to be a co-creator.
It touched me what you said about fate and destiny. And how we relate differently. Let us move into a little bit the world of women. What are some of the patterns that you see moving through women collectively across culture, family, systems, leadership, sexuality, spiritual identity?
Linking into what I said earlier about Hestia, seeing the circle almost in itself as, again, an archetype rather than the pyramid. I also feel that for many women, there is the call not to just be the mystic or the artist, but the mystical artist. I think the mystical artist is actually a key archetype for women. The crone, and that sense of, from the fairy tales, we have the crone with some ugly mole and a large nose and stirring a cauldron in the forest, and she could be dressed in Louis Vuitton, walking down the Champs-Élysées or whatever other, or maybe Bond Street in London, or any of the avenues in New York, looking fabulous in Gucci and a full face of makeup. But I also feel that there was so many young women that actually have the energy of the crone, and those that chronologically might be in the crone era are actually more maiden and core-like in their behavior. And so actually, how do we sit at the feet of those younger, like in a way chronologically younger than us, but archetypally wiser than us? Can we actually do that? Will our pride allow ourselves to do it? And just probably two others, which would, I think to your audience would be familiar, which is Demeter and Greece as a civilizing force, as we can see with everything going on in the world at the moment. And Hecate in regards to obviously liminality and crossroads discernment. But what I really would just want to say is the archetypes for women that are the ones that this year for us to be working with are the ones that do not promise rescue, but actually require our active participation.
I love how you describe a contemporary modern day crone. It doesn't need to be like that, but I like that it's included and all is included. And these different types of archetypes that you see, I wonder if you can add a few words in the mystic artist. I thought that was a very interesting pair of words.
There's a difference between, like when you read a book, I always say it's more like shelf knowledge versus when it's like cellular and embodied and it's become a part of you. And I feel that what art does is it's like a transmission. And sometimes you might even have gone to see someone that might be more in the spiritual field, and it's a conversation between this X person and Y person. And it did stay at the realm of conversation. But I've had that experience, and I'm presuming your readers also have too, that there could have also been a conversation where it was actually much more a transmission of grace. And in that, if we look at, say, an artist, or even just if we want to use the most, I guess, mass example, but Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa, that every time you look at it, there's a different smile, a different part of it. It's almost like the wisdom, in a way, the painting, in a way, mutates to meet you where you are. And I do think sometimes that there are friends and people in our lives, and maybe yourself sometimes, it's not like you get on a soapbox, but there's almost the preacher or the orator almost engages some aspect of a divinity that you haven't touched before, that the receiver of the message is changed just by being in the field or just by being close to and in resonance with what is being said. And I think that the art, almost in a way, it is a transmission of mystical truths and how they can be combined.
Art really is medicine for the soul and the key for a woman's vitality. I feel that. And it could be painting the Mona Lisa, but it can actually just be as well setting a beautiful table, bringing in that Hestia energy as well, and just tending for the home and tending for that inner fire with a creative sense and a creative feel.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's part of it, is like we don't relegate art to being a canvas and some paints. It's the way that we actually move through the world. It's our perception. It's much broader than that.
And what are the archetypes that you feel are rising, not necessarily as an ideal for women, but as a necessity right now? And what are some of the ones that are being distorted or commodified?
And again, to your viewers, this will probably be quite obvious, but definitely the warrior. Too much masculine, on guard, hypervigilant, the inability to relax, a hijacked nervous system. So I feel that there's archetypes of destiny and there's archetypes of necessity. So you might be going through a very difficult divorce and you need to take on that archetype of the warrior. Maybe children are involved. Maybe there's been some gross negligence involved. But that doesn't mean you stay in the pattern of the archetype. It was just that the warrior pattern was needed to be enacted to be able to survive a few very challenging courtroom appearances. But it wasn't actually supposed to be the pattern for the rest of your life. And so I think, again, with more work being done and showing about how a dysregulated nervous system keeps us either in the fight or flight or kind of survival mode, again, it's almost like the trying to use archetypes of the patriarchy to find your way out, but actually just finding yourself then complicit. So I think it's like, where are we complicit with archetypes that, in a way, don't allow us to be our full selves? And within that, if you said, okay, what's distorted, or what could we even say be commodified? I would say one would be the muse. So this idea that the feminine can only be a muse to the masculine instead of for herself. For her own purposes, can I be my own muse? Instead of only in service to some form of an aspect of a capitalist patriarchal monarch system. But I would also say, on a more broader level, the muses per se have been distorted in the sense that their inspirations are hijacked in a sense to what is either palatable to the mass market, or they're never in their original potency, because either the person doesn't have the strength for the transmission, or actually sometimes just 1% of it is enough to people that maybe are not well versed in this world to believe that 1% is 100% potency, when really it's just a dilution and a knockoff.
This is very intriguing. When you said that we could be taken or stayed forever in the warrior archetype, and that's the danger of becoming the archetype. We become trapped by it, calcified by it, when actually it's about being in relationship with the archetype and allowing it to evolve. If women are using the archetype of the warrior as a resource, as a need, and coming into the relationship and channeling those qualities for the times that they need, how would it be for a woman who feels that way? How can they move forward from it? How can they detach themselves?
It's such a good point. And please, I hope that no one listening takes away this idea that I'm shaming someone if they've gotten into that warrior state. It's not my intention at all. But what I would say is one way to be able to mitigate it is to be able to say, I'm on a mission. A bit when people actually do go and fight, they are on a particular mission, which is a beginning date and an end date. So it would be, I will consciously be in this warrior state until the end of the year, because by then I hope custody has been arranged of my child and the distributing of resources, etc., has happened. So it's actually the ability to be able to confine it towards a time period. I think there's also to be able to recognize that there's different types of warriors. There's the way of the spiritual warrior. There's the peaceful warrior. There's a room to move within the warrior archetype. Remember, please don't think it's just this black and white. There's so many gradients and colors, or the whole keys of life that can be played within that. So I would also say, don't become the warrior that like burns the village to save a bridge. And I would be really careful of what type of warrior you're going to be.
What a great image. The warrior that burns a village to save a bridge. It's a powerful image. And the collective conversation often splits into two extremes, the hyper-independent woman versus the return to tradition woman. I think we're seeing a lot of that return to tradition woman after we have experienced almost in due right, a failure of the superwoman archetype that conquers both the home and the public realm. But archetypally, what is the polarity here between these two actually about?
There's obviously the Jungian concept of holding the two polarities at their most extreme points, so the third numinous appears. It also shows how we're trying to move away from either or to both. And again, your viewers are probably familiar with that F. Scott Fitzgerald quote, the sign of intelligence is being able to hold two opposing viewpoints in the mind at the same time and not go insane. This is just now every day, like the capacity to be able to do that. I would also say that we need to recognize the difference between a stereotype and an archetype. So often what we're speaking about is stereotypes and not archetypes. An archetype will always have a fate to destiny journey involved and not be something that's just a two-dimensional thing. But I think what the polarity is giving rise to at the moment, especially like you said, stay-at-home or independent mums, or it's because polarity has always given identity, it gives belonging, it gives safety. And no matter how much work we do in myths or archetypes or the symbolic realm, safety will always talk truth. We like to believe that truth wins, but actually safety does. And so it's what is the safety that I am finding in these polarities? Because we just go, oh yeah, I'm not in the murky middle. Because when I'm in the murky middle, that requires either self-definition or being misunderstood and judged. And you've got, in a way, one side saying, I'll rely on no one. And then the other is saying, no, someone else must hold order. So what actually then is missing in that polarity structure is initiated authority. So that is in a structure that can relate without collapsing or dominating.
I feel very attached to something you said about the journey of an archetype always involves fate and destiny. Can you elaborate a little bit on this?
Because I think that there's, in a way, archetypes, we could say, they're their own trend, they're their own buzzword. They're like, which feminine archetype are you? And everyone's asking a quiz and all those kind of things, right? A lot of the people would not then recognize that actually within an archetype exists a world. And with an archetype, there is a mythology involved. There is language, there is gestures, there is behavior, there is posture. It's like literally is a world, right? And that's why archetypes are so powerful, because they really are these invisible forces like influencing reality. And to be able to, I guess, in a way, unlock them, it does require something beyond either a binary declaration or a external judgment. And so an archetype to me, it's always universal. It always contains light and shadow and has ancient origins. And so often when you look at a stereotype, it doesn't have any of those three.
Thank you for deepening on this. And when you talked before about the inner authority, was that the word you used?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. How can we come more into contact with it? Are there practices? Is there a specific myth you would recommend? Images, symbols? If someone wants to cultivate a relationship with that archetype of the inner authority, How can we come closer to it?
Yeah, I think that one way is, look, there's a lot to despair about in the world. I don't want to be Pollyanna about it at all, but despair usually comes from thinking this shouldn't be happening. And bypassing comes from pretending it isn't. And the mythic stance really is more, this is happening. What is it asking of us? And so that ability, you will be able to get in touch with your inner authority, not through complaining it shouldn't be happening, not pretending it's not happening, but actually going, oh, it is. And what is it actually asking of me? And I think that would be almost what the feminine is asking of us in this era, which is much more the focus beyond about the physical embodiment, about wisdom. We have data, we have information, we have knowledge, but we never really talk about wisdom. And I think Goethe's line of the eternal feminine draws us on could really be, if you wanted a slogan for the era. And another aspect that I would recommend if you wanted to get in touch with what that inner authority is, again, I will sound like a broken record and I don't really care, but you really do have to nurture the right hemisphere. The world is demanding of us at the moment that we develop a mythical consciousness, that we have an archetypal eye, a symbolic awareness, poetic imagination. It's almost like it's like that is our new curriculum. So if you want to get in touch with the inner authority, the curriculum is written out there for you. It's time for us to be good students and to start not just like studying the material, like I said, but embodying it. And in that sense, we will know the true meaning of authority, which is to author, because we have been able to author now our new selves into a new experience.
To author, to write our own stories and to take agency and responsibility over those stories as well. Would you say that we are right now, given the state of the world, the amount of wars that we have happening around the world, would you say that we are in an underworld era?
Absolutely. I think that many of us that have been through our own dark nights of the soul, the purpose of that was just to be able to shepherd the collective when it went through theirs and the planet went through theirs. But I do feel in one sense that almost in a way we could say, whether it's compassion fatigue or like burnout, that like I just see too many people trying to do it on their own. They're taking on the individual burden for what is either a systemic, societal or collective issue. And the best thing I can say to people in that sense is, I certainly was raised this way, be the change. Let me offer you an alternative. Maybe why don't we go find and be with others who are already creating the change? Instead of the being the change being, this is just something else that I now as an individual have to be dealing with because the collective isn't, or the systemic nature of it has pushed it into the shadows. It's a bit of a side topic, but if I can just say, Maria, I really think that first the step is, how do we regulate before we take action? And a bit like what you were saying about art and humanities earlier, it's can we surround ourselves in beauty and nature and the universal laws? So I know there's so much at the moment about resilience, which is of its own great. But if I can take it a little bit deeper, I think it's what we're being asked of at the moment in this collective underworld that I think we all agree we are in, which is it is the capacity to stay with ambiguity. It is the willingness to actually grieve without collapsing. And again, what's sorely lacking is discernment, because we're all about certainty. And we are in a culture that is addicted to acceleration. And we might scroll and do all of this on all our devices and get wisdom tidbits in sound bites. But because it didn't come from your own lived experience, you actually can't assimilate what it is that you've just scrolled. And that, again, is the capacity of I've been exposed to something that I don't know how to live. And that leads to all sorts of dangers. But I do think that there is something first about how do we regulate ourselves before we take action? Because when you're in the underworld, you first have to orientate yourself to a whole new world, which has different rules and laws than the upper world.
There was something you shared that touched me deeply, which was we need to join ourselves with others who are already doing something. I love that. That feels so true to me in my body, because I feel also in this very narcissistic Black Mirror era, everyone wants to pioneer. Everyone wants to say that they are the leader, right? That they have innovated or started something and everyone else is following them. But I love this idea of actually returning to community, because joining something that already existing, joining someone else, it is also entering a community. And then in a world where everyone seems very scattered and very lonely, joining community, I think it's a powerful medicine for the times we live in.
But if someone says to me, I don't know, at some rally trying to get me all motivated, be the change, do you know what it does? It automatically puts me into functional freeze and paralysis. Do you know? But if someone actually just said, why don't you join with others that are already being the change? All of a sudden, oh my gosh, like the generosity of my spirit has just expanded. But in that other version of, oh, you, Kristina, you, Maria, you, like Rebecca, go be the change, we will find ourselves in functional freeze and paralysis in less than 5 seconds.
Absolutely. And considering we are in this kind of underworld phase, what do you feel are the qualities that this time requires of us?
I think one of the first things to mention is that the underworld is not a punishment. I think sometimes when you end up in the underworld, it can be, oh my gosh, what did I do to deserve this? It's not that at all. It is a place where we develop compassion. We remove our pride, our hubris. We learn how to consciously ascend and descend. And the qualities then that are required when we're there are obviously surrender. We're not in control. We're not the one running the show. And linked with that is we need to be able to detach from outcomes. Because in a way, we don't get to decide when we rise again or Hermes comes to find us. Because in a way, we will stay there as long as, in a way, our soul has its own timetable for its own curriculum, which our left brain ego probably is not familiar with. So we're in kindergarten and we want to graduate year 12 all within one day. So I think, again, the ability to be able to detach from the outcome and knowing actually my soul, the way that I actually, in a way, get to engage it is in a moment-to-moment basis. And to be able to be on that almost a micro timetable. And being on the underworld also teaches us, as we were saying earlier, about the importance of community, the need for guidance. But I would also say to be able to make the request for supernatural assistance also.
Are there any myths? This is a very kind of curious question, but are there any myths you caution us against? Myths that keep us trapped, perhaps in pattern or repetition, myths that idolize something that shouldn't be idolized?
I think that we need to be aware first of the storying function of the psyche. So we're always in a story, okay? And the role of inner narrative. Because so often we are the ones that keep us trapped because we're in a loop. And that is the stories we tell to ourselves about ourselves, that they're usually very disingenuous and they're not true. And we first have to be aware of the inner narrative function of the psyche before we can co-create narratives and functions and myths outside of ourselves. So we might want to, on a more colloquial level, describe that as the inner critic. But the first step would be to have the awareness of, again, what is the story I'm telling to myself about myself? But if we look at some of those myths, myths or stories that could keep us trapped, one would be the hero who saves everyone. That one, you can chuck that one in the bin. The chosen one who avoids suffering. That one can go in the bin too. And I would also say endless ascension narratives. Because those stories, those myths, they really trap us in repetition because they're denying descent.
I would love to just go a whole new episode only elaborating on these, both on the awareness towards our inner narrative and then why these other myths should be thrown in the bin, because I do find that very interesting. And I will ask our listeners to pay attention to those when they appear in your life, in whichever form.
And if we can say, okay, so how do you meet that, the constant ascension narrative? Find those death and rebirth narratives because they are much truer to our lives than one that is, even if you just imagine like a stock market grid, which is always a continuous uptick in a gradual linear line going upwards and upwards. Death and rebirth is actually far more intimate cycle for us to be familiar with, and the myths that focus on that.
Absolutely. Life, death, life, the renewal, the cycles of renewal. That's not the repetition. That cycle is a spiral. So it's deepening.
And even art. I think art is another great place, again, when we said the power of humanities, to be able to look at art that celebrates more of the death and the rebirth cycle, again, rather than one that contains a linear timeline.
Thank you so much, Kristina. We're getting to the end, but I still have one question that I would love to ask, and then, of course, ask about your work as well. What practices helps people live mythically in chaotic times, not as an escape, but as deeper participation?
Look, obviously, the easiest thing is read the myths. Develop some mythic literacy. Stephen Fry's, his books are like very comedic, very fun. They're not so dry. So I think that would be like, in a way, a more, if you want, just like a pedestrian answer, like read myths, develop your mythic literacy. Next, I would say it would be, how do we start developing more of our symbolic imagination and working with signs and symbols? So it could be like decoding your dreams. That could be something else you could do. Then from a more meditative perspective, it would be like, how can I practice being the observer? So whether it's the awareness of the story I tell to myself about myself, but much more like we began earlier our conversation with, about the patterns in the collective, so I can observe them. So like I said, even just what ideas are we putting on a pedestal and what are we demonizing? Again, the capacity to observe those. Another thing would be, obviously, because of my love of Persephone, which would be seasonal attunement, really being aware of how the seasons move through us, as well as being aware that there is both a southern and a northern hemisphere. And both of us being in Australia at the moment, I don't know, certainly I don't appreciate Christmas cards with snow on them because it's not reflective of our reality. Another thing would also be conscious endings, being really aware of closing loops. I used to teach leadership and even just small things, which is on your laptop, what are all the open documents that you have? And actually, you think you've closed them, but really you've just minimized them and they're taking up kind of space. So it's that conscious closing of loops and the grieving of chapters. And I think the grieving of chapters is best done in community. Body-based practices, whether it's walking, you might also want to fast from food, but I would say the most important thing is to fast from noise and to, in a way, put silence more on an altar. And to be able to ask just a very simple orientating question, which is, am I being asked to ascend at the moment, or am I being asked to descend? And then operate accordingly.
This felt very inspiring. It felt energizing to think of those tools and those practices as very possible practices, honestly. And I can say for me, at least the one that ringed very deeply, something I need to be aware of, is the silence practice. If you could offer women a guiding myth for 2026, what story would it be?
Gosh, we've covered so much ground, haven't we? It hasn't even gone. So probably to close, I would just say, again, linked with the archetype of being an initiate, there's something there in the Eleusinian mysteries, I think, for all of us. Again, coming back to my beloved Persephone, I don't think it's so much of how do we descend like Inanna, which was, as we know, the first line in the Sumerian poem, where she put her ear to the ground and made the descent. I think it's actually, I'm very actually interested in how we reimagine the myths. And I think a great reimagining we can enter into, which is in the midst of it, in situ, while it is happening, I turn Persephone's forced descent into a conscious descent. As we are alive and in the moment and we are doing it, I think that is absolutely a guiding myth for us all. Because I feel that there's many ways we're all going to be abducted because life interrupts the old identity. And again, remembering that when we're in the underworld, it's not pathology, it's initiation. The outside world will want to give us our labels and our medicine and everything like that and all the pathology that goes with it, but it's not, it's initiation. But what I mean by how we turn it from a forced to a conscious descent while we're living it is that we look at the pomegranate and we stop asking to be rescued and we start choosing to belong to our lives. So I think the more that we can actually start choosing to belong to our lives, it becomes a guiding myth. And that the return is no permanent resolution. It's cyclical. It's going to keep going. So I really think Persephone is teaching us descent. It's not a failure of the light. Really is an expansion of our sight. And we can survive. It's not just about that we survive in both realms, but we actually thrive. And if I can just offer one more thing, because I understand we don't all resonate with all myths. And there might be some people out there going, would you just stop banging on about Persephone because you lost me a long time ago? I will offer you another archetype that can help be a guiding bridge for this year. And I already said the word of it, and it is actually a bridge. So even if we want to go to popular culture and we remember Frozen, Elsa was the bridge between magic and people. And I would invite you to think of all the ways in which you can be a bridge, because the future belongs to those who can grieve and descend and still keep their inner light intact. And the world is actually asking of us not to be a bridge individually, but how we can form bridges with, again, like we said earlier, those who are already being the change.
I love both the myths you shared. Not the myths, the fairy tale, the story there of the Snow Queen Elsa, and the myth of Persephone. I would just add a few words and say that I am there with you, that I love the reimagining of the story. And for me, yes, the descent of Persephone feels like a conscious descent, wanting to be queen of the underworld, wanting to be the queen of the dead, and have that knowledge, have that wisdom. She gains so much as she descends. It's a terrifying descent, but yet she gains so much. And there is another thing you mentioned that it strikes me is as she completes her journey and she keeps returning, she continues as the goddess of spring and now queen of the underworld, queen of the dead. And she lives both states with integrity and in fullness and vitality. And as a mother of a 3-year-old, I have watched Frozen too many times, more times than I can count. And I've done these like mythical analysis as I'm like holding my daughter's hand. And I'm always doing those mythical analysis. And that movie does have, especially Frozen 2, has a lot of references. And it is beautiful to be the bridge, to also be in relationship with the bridge. I think it's also another thing.
There's the ordinary, there's the extraordinary, there's, the imaginary, non-imaginary, linear, non-linear, the feminine, masculine. There's so many ways that we could actually be bridges, and that allows us to be in the both and not the either or, and in a position of integration.
And Kristina, for us to finish, I'm in awe of everything you shared. And I have in the back of my mind just this feeling of, I love my work so much that I can be here sitting, having this conversation with you. I would love to invite our listeners to come discover your work. What's the best place that they should go to? I'll make sure to add those links and information in the show notes.
I just recently started a YouTube channel where I'm doing short snippets of places in Greece and their mythological background. Instagram, my website is a bit not up to date. We're trying to get that back online. And if people just wanted to book in for an archetypal reading, they could just find me on the social media channels, whether it's also Facebook or LinkedIn or anything like that, but just the spelling of my name.
I'll make sure to add those links in the show notes. And that sounds very interesting, an archetypal reading. Would you like to tell our listeners what that looks like?
Oh, yeah, sure. It's what we spoke about earlier, which is looking at archetypal patterns that are influencing you. And I like actually working with the astrological 12 houses, because so often if we just look at an archetype, it's almost in isolation. But I like looking at archetypes. If we imagine the archetype is an actor and an astrological house is the theater stage, you're going to act very differently, whether it's in the first house, which is your identity, your fifth house, which is creativity and good fortune, seventh house, your relationships. Because say if someone had a prominent pattern for them was the shaman, it would show up very differently in your highest potential, to the unconscious, to your expression, to your home life. So it's really just more the granularity and the specificity of it. But as I was saying earlier, so often we are run by these invisible forces, and it's really about a process of how can I just bring them out of the corner of my eye so I can be in conscious relationship with them rather than them unconsciously run me from behind. Because I think part of it is, yes, everyone keeps saying it's all awareness, but there's some things in life, a bit like what we were saying earlier in regards to what is fate, what is destiny, what we have control over, what we don't have control over, that there are many things in our lives that we have the capacity to choose. And I think sometimes when we feel like we don't have choice, it can be sometimes very simple just to be able to say, I am choosing to pour tea from the teapot into my cup right now. And to be able to enact that power of choice back in us. And then to be able to realize there are certain places in my life where I am called to prayer and to surrender.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm sure of reading with you. It's very illuminating. I'm actually now very compelled to do one. Thank you so much. Thank you for all these wonderful ideas. I feel so nourished. I hope our listeners feel too. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for your time, Kristina. It's been an honor, truly.
My pleasure. And I just feel like for me, the greatest thing is how to help others not feel alone in their suffering. And I really just hope that there's someone out there that listens to our conversation and that they don't feel so alone in their suffering. I would feel at least my job for today was done.
I definitely feel less alone. And I feel this conversation was a great way to start the year. Thank you so much. And to our dear myth lovers, see you in our next episode. Until then, remember, your life is a story only you can tell. Stay close to what feels true and sovereign within you.